Hello everyone and welcome to this lesson on web basics. So we'll start off by looking at HTTP, which is the fundamental protocol for the web and the internet. Now HTTP is a request response client server pool protocol. So here you have a web browser which basically functions as a client, and that is basically going to send off a HTTP request message across the web to a HTTP server, or what we call a web server, where a program will be running, a web application will be running, and the web application will then process the request message, and then it will then send back a response message which arrives back at the client, the web browser, which will then render the content of the response message. So in the vast majority of cases, the response message will contain a HTML document, or it will contain a JavaScript program, or it will contain images and so on, that will then be rendered inside your browser. Okay, so this is a request response protocol because a request is sent out, a response is returned. You have a client and a server, and it's also a pool protocol because you are basically pulling back the response from the server rather than the server pushing the response to you actively. Now web applications run on HTTP, and the primary part of the web application will run on a remote server such as this. Okay, so the primary part of a web application is accessed through a browser such as Edge or Chrome or Firefox, and prime examples of web applications are social media apps like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, cloud file sharing and backup like Google Docs, Dropbox and so on, web-based email like Gmail, e-commerce like Lazada and Shopee and so on. All these are basically web applications. The typical architecture style for a web application is 3 tiers. Okay, so you're going to have a presentation layer, an application layer, and a data layer. So let's look at the first layer, the topmost layer, the presentation layer. So the presentation layer or tier is the front end layer which provides the GUI that is accessible through the browser on the client machine. Okay, this tier can be built using pure HTML5, JavaScript and CSS, or you can build it using other popular web development frameworks such as Angular, that is what we'll be learning in this workshop, or React or Vue. These are the 2 other main JavaScript frameworks other than Angular. Okay, so when we do this is typically called client-side scripting. So if you hear the term client-side scripting, you're talking essentially about creating a program that's going to run at the presentation layer of your web application. Then this presentation layer is going to communicate with your application layer, the second layer or the business layer, through an API call that is sent through HTTP requests. So this presentation layer that you see here, it's basically going to be running inside your client, which is basically a web browser, and it's going to send request messages, okay, HTTP request messages through what is called a web API, which we are going to study in more detail in upcoming lab in this workshop. So it's going to send a HTTP request message to a web API that's exposed by the application layer portion of your web application. Okay, so that's what's going to happen. That's how the presentation layer is going to communicate with the application layer. Now the application or the business layer contains the core business logic which drives the application's primary capabilities. Okay, so if your web application is, for example, an e-commerce application, then the business logic might be checking the customer's accounts, checking the customer's order, making sure the customer has a valid credit card and so on. So all of that business logic is implemented in the application layer, and there are a variety of frameworks in a variety of languages such as Python, Java, .NET, C# and so on, which allow us to construct programs that run at application layer. So some of the more popular frameworks are Spring Boot. So if you are using Java, you use something like the Spring Boot framework to develop a program that runs at the application layer. If you work with C# or the .NET environment, you'll probably use the .NET Core framework or the .NET ASP framework to construct a program that runs at this layer. And then finally, the third layer is the data access layer or the data tier, and this essentially comprises the database or the data storage system. So popular examples of these are what we call relational database management systems, such as MySQL, Oracle, PostgreSQL, Microsoft SQL Server, MongoDB. MongoDB is an example of a NoSQL database. That's kind of one of the hot trends now in database technologies. Now the database may be hosted on the same server as the business layer, or it may be on a different dedicated server. Okay, and data, if it's on a different dedicated server, then the data will be accessed by the application layer, again through API calls that are sent through a HTTP request. Alright, let's talk about the three main components that we'll be covering for this workshop, which is basically HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So your Angular is basically, your Angular applications are basically written in TypeScript, which is an enhanced version of JavaScript. So HTML provides the structure and content of your web page. CSS provides the styling and layout. And finally, JavaScript provides the dynamic interactivity. So let's take a look at HTML, right? This is a standard web page here that you see here on the right hand side. This is a standard web page. The structure and the content of this web page is produced using this HTML layout here that you see here. I'm sure most of you already have had some experience in HTML. And then you have CSS. Okay, so this is how CSS looks like. Typically in our HTML document, we have a link that has a href attribute. This references a separate CSS style sheet, and inside the style sheet we have a bunch of CSS style rules which target specific elements within our HTML document and provide appropriate styling. For example, spacing in terms of the margin, color, the colors, the weight of the font, whether it's bold, and so on. Okay, so that is CSS. CSS basically does the styling and the layout for our app. Okay, and the last one, of course, is JavaScript. But before we look at JavaScript, we want to look at a very important part of a web document, which is what we call the DOM, or the Document Object Model. So the DOM is a language independent interface which models a HTML document as an upside down tree. So there's a kind of a tree structure which is used to represent this HTML document, whereby each node of the tree is an object representing a part of the document. Okay, so when a browser loads a HTML file, so when a browser gets back a HTTP response from a web server which contains a HTML document, it's going to load that HTML document as a DOM. Okay, you'll represent it as a DOM, and each HTML element becomes a node or object of this DOM tree. So here's a visual depiction of how this works out. So let's assume that this is your HTML document. So when your HTML document like this gets loaded into your browser, what happens is that your browser will take every single one of the elements in this HTML document, and you'll convert it into an object inside the DOM tree. So you can see the DOM tree is a hierarchical tree. Right at the top you have the document object, then after that you have the root element, which is basically HTML, and then after that you have all the various elements that comprise the body of your HTML document. So all these are different objects within the DOM tree. Now what happens is when your browser loads a JavaScript program, okay, your JavaScript program basically can manipulate this DOM tree. So your browser will expose an API, okay, you expose an API to the JavaScript program. The JavaScript program can call various methods in this API, which will allow it to manipulate this DOM tree. Okay, so what it can do is it can modify any of the DOM elements and any of the properties of these DOM elements. It can react to any existing user events. So user events might be the user clicking at a specific point in the web browser, or typing into a text box, or scrolling through the content on a web page. All these are user events, okay? And the JavaScript program can react to these user events, okay, through this API. So the key point to note here is that when the HTML document is loaded or is returned from the HTTP request and loaded into your browser, the HTML document itself does not change anymore. After the HTML document is retrieved from the HTTP response, it's just stored on the hard disk, and what the browser will do is you take this HTML document, convert it into a DOM tree, and then subsequently the JavaScript program will dynamically alter the contents of the DOM tree. And as the contents of the DOM tree are altered, the view in your web browser will change. Okay, so fundamentally this is how a JavaScript program provides interactivity to your web page. Okay, this is the basic idea, and this is true whether we are working with just pure JavaScript as it is, or whether we are working with a framework such as Angular, React, or Vue. Because at the end of the day, Angular, React, or Vue, or these frameworks, the program, the Angular program or the React program or the Vue program, it's essentially going to be converted back again into JavaScript. So what is running inside your browser at the end of the day is still going to be pure JavaScript, and the JavaScript is going to dynamically change the contents and the structure of this DOM, and that will result in a different view change in the browser. So let me demonstrate this. The best way to actually explain this is to demonstrate this with an example. So here I have a very simple HTML file, okay, and so now if I open up this HTML file here, you can see here you have your standard head for this HTML file. You have a bunch of CSS style rules which I've embedded inside my HTML file using the style tag, okay, and then you have the actual body of the HTML itself, and you have the standard elements, HTML elements like paragraph, an input field, and so on, a field set, and then a couple of paragraphs, again, input field, a select input field, and so on. And then I have a script tag. So the script tag is how I can embed a JavaScript program inside a HTML document. So here, from this line onwards, really all the way down to here is basically my JavaScript program. Okay, so this entire JavaScript program is embedded inside this HTML document. Okay, so for those of you who have worked with JavaScript before, or you have worked with jQuery, which is a JavaScript library, typically you will not embed your JavaScript program directly inside your HTML file. Typically you put it in a separate file and then you reference the JavaScript program from your HTML document. But here I'm just kind of making things simple here, so I've just embedded my entire JavaScript program inside my HTML document. Alright, so I'm not going to really explain what all this code here does. All we need to know is there's a JavaScript program now inside this HTML document. So when I load this HTML document into the browser, the JavaScript program will start running inside the browser. So let's go ahead and load this HTML document into a browser. So I'm going to have an empty tab here now, and I am just going to drag this file here into this browser here. And now you can see that we have some output here, right? We have some output here, which is basically the output from the HTML. And inside here, we also have a JavaScript program that is currently running. So let me just turn on the developer tool. So if I go to my browser here on the right hand side, I'm using Chrome here. Go to More Tools, Developer Tools, and I can actually see this thing called Elements here. So this elements thing here that you see here on the right, this elements view here, is basically showing the DOM tree that I was talking about just now. So remember just now I said that every time a HTML document is loaded in the browser converts it into a DOM tree, right? So right now, in this browser, this is essentially a DOM tree, okay? And if you kind of expand it here, you can see all the various elements in this DOM tree, okay? And right now, at the bottom, you can see there's a script here. This is the script that was originally there. So this is the JavaScript program that's running inside the browser now. So right now, in this tab in the browser, there's a JavaScript program that's running. So let's now see some dynamic interactivity. It's saying creating a category, enter a category to create. So let's say I enter here humans and I click create. What you see is suddenly a box will come out here and then you will say category humans. Okay, and then in this part here that says adding items to category, if I say enter an item to add to a selected category. So let's say here I type doctor and I click add item. Suddenly an bulleted item here will appear inside this box. If I enter another category, say engineer, and I click add item, another item will appear below here. So this is essentially dynamic interactivity, right? The web page content is changing dynamically because of the JavaScript program that is running inside it. And the JavaScript program is basically changing your DOM tree. This is your DOM tree, right? So to actually see this change here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag this down a bit more. We'll just move this a bit to the right so this is a bit more clearer. And now let's go back to this part here. This is the part that or this is the category box location. Right now you can see that there's two items here, these two LI items. This first LI is referring to this doctor here, and you can see here as I hover my mouse over this LI in this elements view, you can see it's highlighted in the left hand side there, and if I hover my mouse over here, the engineer, it's also highlighted in the left hand side there. So right now we have a doctor and an engineer, right? This is currently a DOM tree. Now when I click here and I add another item, okay, so let's say the item now is programmer, right? Because you guys are all programmers. Now let's keep your eye carefully on this part here, on this section here. I want you to keep your eyes carefully on this section here. Now when I click, keep your eyes on this section here, right? When I click add item, you can see dynamically suddenly another LI items appears there with this thing here called programmer, with the content called programmer, right? So who was the one that dynamically added this LI item to this overall OL parent item? What was the thing that added this LI element to this overall parent OL element? The answer is your JavaScript program, right? That's the JavaScript program that is running inside your browser, and this JavaScript program is essentially manipulating the DOM tree, right? So that is fundamentally what JavaScript does, and that's what your Angular program will do as well. So at the end of the day, your Angular program, which is written in TypeScript, is going to get converted into JavaScript, and it's going to be running inside your browser, and it's going to be dynamically changing the DOM tree in the way that I have just described here. Okay, so let's see some more additional dynamic changes here. So for example here, right now we only have one category list. All right, so let's say if I enter another category, if I say animals here, if you keep your eyes on this part here, on this part of the screen here, keep your eyes on this part of the screen here, and if I click on a create here, suddenly you see now there is a second div now with a paragraph and an OL, and now we have a second category. And now if I select here animals and I go down to here and I say cat, okay, again keep your eyes on this part here, this category animals. Again, keep your eyes on here. When I click on the add item, suddenly you see there's an additional LI item that's now added into the top level parent element OL. Okay, so that all of this is being done by the JavaScript program that's running inside the browser. So that's fundamentally what JavaScript does, and that's what your Angular program is also going to do, because your Angular program at the end of the day is going to be converted into JavaScript. Okay, now the other important point to note about all this dynamic interactivity that's happening inside your browser is that it is happening without the need for any further interaction with the web server. So that means as all these changes are happening, there is no longer any more need to send out HTTP requests to the backend web server and to get back a response from backend server in order for this interactivity to run, unless you need to retrieve some data. Otherwise, if you're just changing the DOM tree, the JavaScript program can just run and change the DOM tree without any further communication with the backend web server. Okay, so we'll be looking at how to modify the DOM tree using the API that is going to be exposed to us. So if you are working using pure JavaScript, you will have a set of properties and methods that you can access from the DOM. This is basically the DOM API. So if you have worked with JavaScript before, you're probably already familiar with some of these API properties and methods. And we will also be accessing some of these properties and methods when we are working with Angular. Because remember, at the end of the day, Angular is going to be converted, your Angular program, which is written in TypeScript, is going to be converted into JavaScript, which is running on the web browser. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this presentation.